If the Bible Book Club has been growing your love for Scripture, would you consider supporting the podcast? Every dollar helps us keep the show running and reach more people who want to dive deeper into God's Word just like you are. Tap the link in the show notes. We're so thankful you're here.
This is the Bible Book Club.
The Book of Esther.
Welcome to the club.
Welcome to the Bible Book Club, the Book of Esther. If you just found us for the first time, know that we call this podcast the Bible Book Club because the Bible is the #1 selling book of all time. It must be read, and it is fascinating to discuss. And we make it easy for you to do both. We read and discuss. You can download and listen wherever life takes you, walking, commuting, studying with your friends, or just working around the house.
All right, so here's our setup, and you are going to love this book, everyone, because it is not Leviticus. It is not Deuteronomy. It's not Chronicles. It is a great story. So first, let's talk about how does the Book of Esther fit into the Bible? I've said this before. The Bible is a collection of small stories that together tell a much larger story. The larger story is the entire history of our redemption, with Jesus as the ultimate hero. Now, here's how Esther appears in the Old Testament of the Bible. The Old Testament has 5 divisions. On our podcast journey, we have finished the first division called the Pentateuch, or the books of the law. These were the first 5 books of the Bible. We are in the second division called the history books. There are 12 of these books, and we have discussed 11 of them, which means Esther is the last history book. Therefore, with the completion of Esther, if you've been with us since the beginning, you can check off 2 of the 5 divisions of the Old Testament. Okay, so when do the events in the Book of Esther take place? Esther's story takes place around 486 to 465 BC, during the post-exilic period, the time after King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and Judah. It was at this point that God's people came to be called Jews and not Israelites, which I think you asked me once before, Heather. Because they returned to Judah, they became known as Jews. Now, the books in our prior 2 seasons of the podcast, Ezra and Nehemiah, take place in this same time period. They follow the stories of the Jews who left Persia and returned to Judah. However, Esther's story is not about the Jews who returned to Jerusalem as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were. The Book of Esther takes a different perspective. It's a story about the Jews who stayed in Persia. Okay, so where do the events in the Book of Esther take place? This is such great history. When our story opens, it is about 50 years after King Cyrus of Persia's decree. The Jews in Judah were still struggling to overcome their exile and build a nation. Think of them as kind of in a third world situation. But other nations were experiencing major cultural, intellectual, and political advancement. Persia was the greatest of all and the dominant superpower of the century. But Greece was also rising to its golden age. The Greek Olympic Games had already been around for 200 years. Pericles was building a political system in Athens. Sophocles was writing Oedipus Rex. Socrates was teaching, and Plato would soon be documenting this teacher. Pythagoras established a school, and the Pythagorean theory still used in algebra today. So there is a lot of really crazy, fascinating things going on, while Israel's still in a third world situation. I say all this to set the stage for this drama. This was a period of great wealth, luxury, and political intrigue. The story of Esther takes place in Susa, located in modern-day Iran, and Susa was one of the Persian Empire's greatest treasures. So we have left Jerusalem behind. It was a mess there. We are in the lap of luxury. The palace in Susa was built on a 49-foot-high platform covering 250 acres. It was massive. The banquet hall where King Xerxes held his grand feasts and where our story begins had 72 columns, each 65 feet high. The details in the Book of Esther match the excavated palace so precisely that scholars believe whoever wrote Esther must have personally spent time there. The French archaeologist Jean Perrault said this:
"One today rereads with renewed interest the Book of Esther, whose detailed description of the interior of the palace of Xerxes is now in excellent accord with archaeological reality."
For all fascinated by archaeology, I will include a link in the show notes to a post about the palace with a really cool picture of a capitol. That's just the top of one of those 72 columns, which can be seen in the Louvre in Paris. It is absolutely huge and beautiful. I cannot begin to imagine 72 of these standing 65 feet high. Well, the king who rules this enormous Persian palace is Xerxes, one of the main characters in the Book of Esther. Now, if you'll recall, Cyrus was the first Persian king. We met him in the Book of Ezra. Cambyses was Cyrus's son, but he's never mentioned in the Bible. Darius, the next king, was only distantly related to Cyrus, and he was also mentioned by Ezra. He ascended to the throne by assassinating an alleged usurper. Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, was the fourth king, and he's the main character in this book. He was not Darius's oldest son, who normally would have been king. King Darius chose Xerxes over his half-brother Artabazenes because Xerxes was also the son of Atassa. Now, Atassa was one of Cyrus's daughters, which is really confusing because Cyrus is like 3 generations ahead. So he must have been having children well into his old age. As Atassa's son, Xerxes had a direct link back to the founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, and that's why Darius chose him to be his successor. Now, the fifth king is Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes. I mention him only because we've already met him. He was the king who sponsored the return of Ezra and Nehemiah. And if you followed all that, you realize that the story of Esther, which follows the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, actually occurred chronologically before Ezra and Nehemiah's return.
One more reason it is so good studying the Bible with you, because that can be confusing. So now we have that context as we go into reading this book.
Yes. So many theologians place the story of Esther chronologically between the 6th and 7th chapters of Ezra. Okay. About the Book of Esther. Who wrote it? We don't know. Nobody knows. Well, moving on. What is the main theme or purpose of the Book of Esther? So many purposes here. Listen to this. One purpose of this book would be to record the deliverance of the Jewish people during the reign of King Xerxes and to record why Purim was added to the required feasts and festivals. So we're going to get to all that, but just know that's one purpose. Another purpose would be a reminder of the fulfillment of God's promise to destroy the Amalekites in Exodus 17. They were the first nation to attack the Israelites right after they left Egypt. We're going to get to that too. So just hold on. But no, these are the reasons everyone supposes for this book because it's so unique. Another interesting theme that runs throughout the book is that the events revolve around banquets. There are 10 altogether. Vashti is going to say no at a banquet. Esther gains favor through banquets. Esther reveals her identity at a banquet. The book uses feasting or banquets as the vehicle through which God orchestrates his hidden providence. The story ends in a declaration of a new national feast. Again, we're in this banquet feast theme, to be celebrated annually called Purim, which is the last religious feast or festival decreed in the Bible. Now, they've added others since then, like Hanukkah, but this was the last one in the Bible. And it's still celebrated joyfully today on the 14th and 15th of March. You can see the show notes for all the feasts commanded in the Old Testament. We'll go ahead and put our chart of that in the show notes. Okay, here is the most intriguing fact about this book. God is not mentioned, not even once. There are only 2 books in the Bible that do not mention God, Esther and Song of Solomon, and the theologians argue about Song of Solomon because there's kind of this like a side mention of him, but not really. But why is God not mentioned in the Book of Esther? I think it was an ingenious move and an example to us. Think about it. During this time, the people are in exile because they have left God out of the story by turning to other gods. They had forgotten God's name, his promises. They weren't talking about him, but he has not forgotten them. So God starts making moves to remind them, as if to silently prove that although they had written him out of their story, he was indeed still the author. Even when his name was not mentioned, he was there. This is interesting. Recall from our last 2 seasons that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, God moved King Cyrus, the king of Persia, to free the Jewish captives. And the 3 waves of return happened under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. God was moving people to and into Jerusalem. But right in the middle of those 3 waves of returns, God made a silent move to remind those who had stayed behind in Persia. He wanted them to remember his promise to save them also. That is our current story, the Book of Esther. So again, this kind of moving is telling the people a story without them even knowing it. The intriguing point in this story is that God can move for his people, his purposes behind the scene, while the world is unaware. God's name is never mentioned in the Book of Esther, but God's hand is visible in every coincidence, every reversal, in the textbook timing, and in the perfect positioning of the players. It's a point for us to remember. God is still at work today behind the scenes. The story of Esther is our example of how God does that so we won't miss it. This is another of the purposes of this book. God was teaching the Israelites and us to look for him working behind the scenes, moving people and situations so that all things work together for his good. The theological term for the hidden movement of God is divine providence. So what is divine providence? A helpful way to break it down is by looking at the word's origin. Providence starts with pro, before, and vidir, to see. It literally means to see beforehand. So divine providence means God sees what is coming and acts ahead to orchestrate events according to his purpose. Now, this is not the first story of divine providence we have discussed on our journey. The story of Joseph, which culminated in Genesis 45, you can listen to season 1, episode 34 for that, was another example. Joseph, like Esther, was placed in a really difficult situation, sold into slavery. But God moved behind the scenes to put him in a position to save his people in the palace of Pharaoh. At the end of Genesis, Joseph sums up the tragedy turned triumph of his life story with this.
In Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 19, but Joseph said to his brothers, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives."
The entire Bible, from Genesis to Esther to the book of Acts, in the entire Bible, God has been working to deliver his people. Listen to Acts 2:22.
Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him.
Divine providence. God sees what is coming and acts ahead to orchestrate events according to his purpose. Jesus' death on the cross was God's plan all along. His ultimate divine providence to bring salvation to all. Now, if you'd like to see more examples of God's divine providence, I don't have time to go through them all. We have a chart on the website, and the link to it is in the show notes.
I just love that you're showing that to us before we start to read it, so we have all that context. I think it makes a perspective that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Perfect. All right. In summary, what is the Book of Esther about? Here's your sentence. I was trying to boil it down to a sentence with each book. The Book of Esther is the story of how God's providence works behind the scenes through the courage and wisdom of faithful individuals to save his people. All right, this Book of Esther is the perfect encouragement for you whenever you find yourself in a difficult, even dangerous situation that you never saw coming and do not think you are equipped to handle. For such a time as this, you must trust in God and his hidden divine providence, like Esther. And that brings us to our verse for this book.
Esther 4:14. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.
Okay, one last thing before we begin this fascinating story. Who are the main characters in the Book of Esther? The Book of Esther has 4 main characters. Xerxes, the Persian king. Haman, a Persian official and the villain. Esther, a Jewish orphan, also known as Hadassah in some versions of the Bible. Mordecai, Esther's Jewish uncle. In this opening scene, we only meet one of them, the king. Now, King Xerxes, we know, is the 4th king of Persia. Because of the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote the history of the Persian Wars, we actually know a lot about Xerxes. Herodotus describes Xerxes as the tallest and most handsome of the Persian kings, who had an excess of pride, was an ambitious and ruthless ruler, and a jealous lover. Apparently, Herodotus had intel about Xerxes' disastrous passion for his sister-in-law and later for a niece. I would like to digress on the resulting bloody court intrigue, but that would be another book club, as none of this is documented in the Bible. Now, when our story opens, King Xerxes is holding a banquet. Scene 1, the banquet that set the stage for divine providence.
Esther chapter 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor of the glory of his majesty.
This is the first of 3 banquets that providentially opened the door for Esther to become queen. Note, this banquet lasted 180 days. That's 6 months of feasting, and this was not an exaggeration. The banquet of days had an important purpose. It was a strategic house party to gain support for a military campaign. It involved hosting a multitude of leaders from many provinces across Persia. Now, some theologians do not think that they all stayed the whole time or were all there at the same time, but many traveled from a great distance, and who wouldn't stay? We don't know the exact number of attendees at any given moment. However, the purpose is historically documented. When Xerxes ascended the throne, Persia and Greece were in conflict. Persia was at its peak. The power of Greece was growing. Xerxes' father Darius had been defeated in an attempt to take Athens, and Xerxes wanted to avenge his father's defeat. Here in the Book of Esther, he is preparing the Persians for their next campaign against Greece. The banquet held in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign corresponds to the Great Persian War Council held in the exact same year, 483 BC, where it is documented that Xerxes gathered support from all the nobles by displaying his wealth. And again, this was Herodotus who documented this. So what would that 180-day banquet be like? Imagine that glorious palace I already described, filled with the most important people in the most important... Imagine that glorious palace that we already described, filled with the most important people in the most powerful empire in the world. Drinking, dining, laughing, plotting for days on end. The boasts of their prideful king spilling into their cups. The propaganda flowing as freely as the wine until they were intoxicated with their own national importance. Who wouldn't succumb to such affluence and influence? By the end of the party, they probably couldn't wait to reunite on the battlefield of Greece with visions of another 180-day celebration at the palace after their inevitable win. Little did they know what we know. Xerxes will return from Greece 4 years later after a surprising defeat that depleted his royal wealth. This is the first of many ironic reversals in the Book of Esther.
Continuing in Esther chapter 1, verse 5. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished.
So the 100-day banquet for the nobles is over, and now this second banquet was to win over the people, most of whom would likely be enlisted in fighting the campaign. The entire city of Susa was invited to a 7-day party in the garden. The gold goblets, each unique, were filled and refilled without limit. With each sip, the men drank deeply of the king's imperial propaganda until they were convinced that Persia was invincible. With every day and every drink, the momentum was growing, and with it, the king's pride inflated. How could it not? Had there ever been a display of such wealth in all the world? Had any leader ever been so successful in unifying the leaders of his nation and motivating the people? From where the king was sitting, he was the most powerful king ever, and no one would dare to refuse him anything. Scene 2, Queen Vashti refuses the king.
Verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Meuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abgatha, Zethar, and Xerxes to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger.
While King Xerxes was entertaining, so was the queen, with a banquet of her own for the women. Now, Persian culture had strict gender separation at royal banquets, with men and women holding separate social events. They were separate but parallel expressions of power. The queen's banquet was like Xerxes, a political move, since the noble women of the kingdom would be present, giving Queen Vashti control of another valuable group of political influencers, the wives. This banquet would have been equally opulent and I would imagine even more beautiful aesthetically. So the queen is feasting with the ladies. And the king is in high spirits from wine. He's drunk. And maybe in his drunkenness, he wanted to show off the queen because he had shown off every other beautiful thing he could by this time. And the queen was beautiful, and it sounds like very well dressed. And he was probably getting bored. His queen would add excitement, just like a parade through the palace, for she would have been seated on an elaborately decorated royal litter, lifted high and carried around for all to see. The dramatic entrance would have been a great addition to his party. But by linking the king's drunkenness to the command to Vashti, the author implies that the king's idea is perhaps not wise and very impulsive, and that he would not have made such a request had he not been drinking. Well, before we move on, who was Queen Vashti and why did she refuse King Xerxes? We know almost nothing of Vashti's background other than she was not Jewish, but much has been written about why she refused the king. Persian queens had power and influence in their own right. This is documented. They were economically independent, managed their own estates, employed workers, and oversaw building projects. Edinburgh University's History Journal studied the power of women in the Persian court and found that
one of the main privileges of royal Persian mothers and wives, according to both classical and indigenous sources, was their autonomy. These royal women were free to travel alone around the empire with their own attendants, as shown by clay tablets depicting Erdabama, the mother of Darius I, traveling with her daughter-in-law, Irstuna. Royal women's autonomy is also reflected in the fact that they could hold their own banquets. This is depicted in the Book of Esther in the Hebrew Bible and is inferred by the large numbers of food ordered by the king for the queen, suggesting feasts involving hundreds of people. Similarly, Plato records that Amystress, the mother of Artaxerxes I, possessed her own vast estates, and Xenophon writes that Parysis, the wife of Darius II, had her own villages close to the river Chalus. These activities indicate how crucial royal women were for facilitating and establishing social relations within the court, as shown by the banquets they hosted amongst other elites and by their travels across the empire. Thus, by maintaining good social relations, royal women could secure the king's and thereby their own positions, while also fulfilling their own ambitions and maintaining the king's favor.
So at the time in the Persian court, Queen Vashti wasn't just decorative. She wielded real authority, and the queen's defiance was most likely justified. Otherwise, the author of the story, almost certainly a man, living in a patriarchal era, would not have written the scene as he did. It certainly appears that she is the more noble of the two, for there is no mention of her refusing because she was high in spirits. She made a difficult decision in her right mind, knowing that it was risky for her because she was married to a man, a king, known to be volatile. But God, in his providence, moved to make this situation what it was, impossible for her to comply with. If she complied with the king, she could be humiliated or mauled by hundreds of drunken men. If she refused the king, she would face a volatile king drunk on his own arrogance. She wasn't going to win either way. She made her choice, perhaps emboldened by the Lord, and she refused the king. To the king and his noble audience, her refusal was a direct challenge to his authority. She had defied the king, her husband, a man, and the king was humiliated. His wine-infused pride had fallen flat, and he was furious. The king, surrounded by nobles he meant to impress, had to act quickly to save face. He had to reassert his power to prove to everyone, including himself, that he was the one in control. What he didn't know was that he was never in control in the first place. God was. In the king's desperation to salvage his pride, he set in motion an unforeseen set of events that would deliver the Jews from certain death. Scene 3. the defiance that set the stage for deliverance.
Verse 13, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king, Karshena, Shethar, Adamatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end to disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree. Let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household using his native tongue.
I can just see the king quickly stepping into another room, his fury gathering all his advisors because he's just humiliated. And the advisors, they blow the incident way out of proportion, fearful that all women will now refuse their husbands. And the king makes a rash decision that he later regrets. Because had he been sober, he would have never asked his wife to display her beauty before his drunken leaders. And maybe that is why men and women had separate banquets in Persia, because there was such liberality in the drinking. Well, the king accepts his advisor's authoritative advice. He banishes Vashti and issues an edict about wifely obedience and male rulership in the household. But what is really going on here? Divine providence. God moved behind the scenes to use marital conflict between the most powerful king and queen in the world to save his people. Vashti exercised her autonomy. Xerxes removed her, and suddenly the path opened for Esther. Divine providence is always at work, everywhere in the world, even today. But before we turn the page in our next episode and leave this queen behind as another takes the stage, we should note that in the Persian court, the king wielded absolute power. All bowed to his whims. The next queen will be under even more pressure to please this king or face the unpredictable consequences of his anger due to this new wifely obedience edict. By introducing Esther's story with Vashti's, the author wants us to fully comprehend the difficulty of Esther's position. By marrying this king, she will walk a tightrope of tension for life. One wrong move and she could fatally fall. This isn't a fairy tale rise to power, and it certainly wasn't what Esther wanted for her life. But just as God controlled Xerxes, God controlled Esther too, and he had a plan to use her for such a time as this.
If the Bible Book Club has been growing your love for Scripture, would you consider supporting the podcast? Every dollar helps us keep the show running and reach more people who want to dive deeper into God's Word just like you are. Tap the link in the show notes. We're so thankful you're here. And if you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you and all your friends can listen and discuss. New episodes drop every Monday.